In the savage wilderness of the Dakota Badlands, where death stalks every ridge and mercy is as rare as water, a 16-year-old girl with nothing but her father's broken compass and iron will in her heart would walk 200 miles through hell itself to reach sanctuary. When starvation and exposure finally claimed her strength on the seventh day, collapsing her frail body beside a sacred Modoc burial ground, the last thing she expected was for a legendary war chief to emerge from the shadows and carry her to safety. Neither the broken white girl nor the exiled Modoc leader could have known that this moment of desperate rescue would forge an alliance that would shake the very foundations of the frontier and challenge everything both their peoples believed about survival, honor, and the bonds that transcend all boundaries of blood and tradition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 1876. The town of Deadwood Gulch buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that comes before a storm breaks. 16-year-old Mercy Blackwood stood at the edge of what had been her family's general store, watching strangers rifle through the belongings that represented 3 generations of frontier survival. Her calloused hands clenched and unclenched as she counted the coins in her threadbare pocket for the 100th time that morning. $14.37. Everything her family had built, reduced to pocket change that wouldn't. By passage on a wagon train to anywhere that mattered, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty street like a death knell. Sold to Mr. Cornelius Vance for $23. Next item, this fine collection of medical supplies and remedies. Mercy's throat tightened as she watched her mother's carefully organized medicine bottles disappear into the hands of people who had no idea of their true value. Each bottle represented late nights when her mother, Sarah Blackwood, had tended to miners' injuries and children's fevers, accepting payment in beans and bacon when coin wasn't available. The irony wasn't lost on Mercy that the very kindness that had made her family beloved in Deadwood Gulch had also made them vulnerable to Cornelius Vance's calculated cruelty. When the diphtheria outbreak had swept through the mining camps the previous winter, her parents had exhausted their savings buying medicine to treat families who couldn't pay. They'd mortgaged the store to fund relief efforts, believing that their neighbors' gratitude would translate into loyalty when times got better. They'd been tragically wrong. Vance had arrived in Deadwood 6 months ago with lawyers, Eastern money, and the kind of polished ruthlessness that frontier folk didn't recognize until it was too late. He'd systematically bought up the debts of struggling businesses, foreclosed on properties during the worst economic downturn the territory had seen in a decade, and consolidated power with the patient efficiency of a spider spinning its web. The Blackwood family store, with its prime location and established customer base, had been his crown jewel. The foreclosure papers had been served on a Tuesday morning, while Mercy was teaching reading to the miners' children in the back room of the store. Her father, Thomas Blackwood, had aged 10 years in the space of that conversation with Vance's lawyers. Her mother had simply sat down heavily in her rocking chair and stared out the window for 3 hours straight, as if she could will away the reality of their situation through sheer force of determination. Now, watching the last of her family's possessions change hands, Mercy felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest that had sustained her through 2 weeks of sleepless nights and barely eaten meals. The anger wasn't just at Vance, though he certainly deserved it. It was at the neighbors who crossed the street to avoid meeting her eyes, at the town council that had rubber-stamped Vance's legal maneuvers, at the whole system that allowed prosperity to be stripped away from decent people by men who measured worth only in dollars and cents. Her parents had left Deadwood 3 days ago on the last wagon train of the season, heading east to stay with her mother's sister in Missouri. They'd begged Mercy to come with them, but she'd refused with the stubborn pride that was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. At 16, she was old enough to make her own choices, and she'd chosen to stay and fight even. When the odds were impossibly stacked against her, the plan had seemed reasonable when she'd first conceived it. Fort Laramie was 200 miles southwest through the Badlands, but it was also the last place in the territory where a person could start over without questions or baggage from the past. The fort needed skilled workers, and Mercy had inherited her mother's knowledge of herbal medicine and her father's head for business. More importantly, Fort Laramie was where her brother Daniel was stationed with the 7th Cavalry. Danny would help her get established, maybe even help her save enough money to bring their parents back west when the economic situation improved. 200 miles through some of the harshest terrain in the Dakota Territory. Mercy had walked long distances before, had helped her father on supply runs to the outer mining camps, had spent her whole life in country where self-reliance wasn't a virtue, but a necessity for survival. How hard could it be? As she watched Vance himself emerge from the store, carrying her father's prized collection of surveying instruments, Mercy felt her resolve crystallize into something hard and unbreakable. She would not give this man the satisfaction of witnessing her complete defeat. She would not crawl back to Missouri with her tail between her legs like some defeated animal. She was a Blackwood, and Blackwoods didn't surrender as long as they had breath in their bodies and fight in their hearts. The auctioneer was wrapping up the sale, and the crowd was beginning to disperse when Vance approached her with the careful steps of a man who knew he held all the cards but wanted to savor his victory. "Miss Blackwood," he said, removing his expensive hat with mock courtesy, "I trust you've had time to reconsider my generous offer of employment." Mercy had been dreading this conversation for days, but now that it was here, she found herself calmer than she'd expected. Vance's generous offer had been extended the day after the foreclosure, couched in language that made it sound like charity, but delivered with the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. A position as a clerk in his new consolidated general store, working for wages that would barely cover room and board in the company housing he'd established above the shop. Essentially, he wanted to keep her as an indentured servant, trading on her family's reputation with customers while paying her a fraction of what her work was worth. "I've given your offer all the consideration it deserves, Mr. Vance," Mercy replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "and I find I must respectfully decline." Vance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. And might I ask what other prospects you've arranged for yourself? Winter's coming, and I'm not aware of any other establishments in town that are hiring." "I'm leaving Deadwood," Mercy said simply. "There's nothing for me here anymore." "Leaving?" Vance's eyebrows rose in what might have been genuine surprise. "Where exactly does a 16-year-old girl plan to go with no money, no connections, and winter approaching?" Mercy felt a surge of satisfaction at being able to surprise him, even slightly. "That's my concern, not yours, Mr. Vance." For a moment, Vance's mask slipped completely, and Mercy saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that made her understand why grown men had been intimidated into selling their businesses for fractions of their worth. "Let me be very clear about something, Miss Blackwood," he said quietly. "I made you a fair offer out of respect for your family's service to this community. That offer won't remain open indefinitely, and there won't be another one like it." "Winter in the Badlands kills people, young lady. Smart people accept help when it's offered. And smart people also know when help comes with too high a price," Mercy shot back. "Good day, Mr. Vance." She turned and walked away before he could respond, her spine straight and her pace measured despite the urge to run. She could feel his eyes on her back like a physical weight, but she didn't allow herself to look over her shoulder until she'd turned the corner onto the side street where she'd been staying in the boarding house Mrs. Patterson ran for single women. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The boarding house room was small and spartanly furnished, but it had been home for the 2 weeks since her parents' departure, and Mercy felt a pang of unexpected nostalgia as she gathered her few remaining possessions. Everything she owned now fit into a single canvas pack that had belonged to her father during his days as a territorial scout. Her spare dress, carefully mended and remended until it was more patch than original fabric. Her mother's small leather journal filled with remedies and medical knowledge. Her father's compass, its brass case worn smooth by decades of use. A small pouch containing her $14.37. And wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the last photograph ever taken of her family, captured by a traveling photographer just 3 months before their world had fallen apart. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway as Mercy was tying down her pack. The older woman's face was creased with worry, and Mercy could see her wrestling with the desire to offer help and the practical knowledge that she couldn't afford to antagonize someone as powerful as Cornelius Vance. "Child," Mrs. Patterson said softly, "you don't have to do this. I could speak to Reverend Morrison, see if the church could find you a position somewhere. Maybe with a family in Rapid City who needs help with their children." Mercy appreciated the offer more than she could express, but she also knew that any position arranged through local connections would ultimately put Mrs. Patterson and Reverend Morrison at risk of Vance's displeasure. "You've done more than enough for me already," she replied, shouldering her pack and testing its weight. "I can't ask you to risk your own security for my sake, but where will you go? How will you survive out there alone?" Mercy moved to the window and looked out at the Badlands stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes that could be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It was country that demanded respect and punished mistakes with swift, impartial cruelty. But it was also country where a person could disappear and reinvent themselves, where determination and skill mattered more than family connections or accumulated wealth. "Fort Laramie," Mercy said finally. "My brother's stationed there, and they need people with skills. I know medicine, I can read and write and cipher, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Patterson moved to stand beside her at the window. "That's 200 miles through the worst country in the territory, child. And winter's coming. The smart thing would be to wait until spring, maybe catch a ride with one of the freight wagons that run supplies to the fort." Mercy had considered that option, but it wasn't realistic given her circumstances. The freight companies charged passage, fees she couldn't afford, and more importantly, they wouldn't be making any more runs until spring. By then, Vance would have consolidated his control over Deadwood completely, and any chance of maintaining her independence would be gone forever. "The smart thing," Mercy said quietly, "would have been for my parents to never trust their neighbors' promises in the first place." "Sometimes the smart thing and the right thing aren't the same, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman sighed and pressed something into Mercy's hand. It was a small cloth bag that clinked softly with the weight of coins. "It's not much," she said quickly, "but it might help you buy supplies along the way." Mercy tried to hand the bag back, but Mrs. Patterson stepped away and shook her head firmly. "Your mother delivered 3 of my grandchildren when the doctor couldn't get through the snow. Your father never charged me full price for supplies when my husband was laid up with the lung fever. Good deeds deserve to be repaid, child. That's how civilization works, even out here." Fighting back tears, Mercy tucked the bag into her pack next to her mother's journal. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't forget this." "You just focus on surviving out there," Mrs. Patterson replied. "And when you get to Fort Laramie, you write me a letter so I know you made it safe." Mercy left Deadwood Gulch at first light. The Next morning, when the town was still quiet and the only witnesses to her departure were the roosters crowing from the chicken coops behind the saloons, she'd spent the previous evening studying her father's detailed maps of the territory, plotting a route that would take her through the least dangerous terrain while still making reasonable time toward her destination. The first day's walking was almost pleasant. The weather was crisp but not cold, and the trail was well marked and relatively easy to follow. Mercy made good time across the rolling grassland that surrounded Deadwood, covering nearly 20 miles before the sun began to set. She made camp beside a small stream, using skills her father had taught her during their supply runs to build a small fire and prepare a simple meal from the provisions she'd purchased with Mrs. Patterson's gift. As she sat beside her fire eating beans and hardtack while the stars emerged overhead, Mercy felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced since the foreclosure proceedings had begun. For the first time in weeks, she was in control of her own destiny, making her own choices and living with the consequences without having to consider how her actions might affect others. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The second day brought her first real taste of what the Badlands had in store for anyone foolish enough to challenge them alone. The well-marked trail petered out into a confusing network of animal paths and dry creek beds, and Mercy found herself consulting her father's compass constantly as she tried to maintain her southwesterly heading toward Fort Laramie. The temperature rose steadily throughout the day, reaching levels that seemed impossible for October, and her water supplies began to dwindle faster than she'd anticipated. By the third day, Mercy began to understand why experienced frontiersmen spoke of the Badlands with a mixture of respect and fear. The landscape seemed designed to disorient travelers, with identical-looking ridges and valleys stretching in every direction like a maze carved from red sandstone and clay. Her father's compass still pointed reliably north, but magnetic north and true north weren't the same thing in this part of the territory, and the margin of error grew larger with every mile she traveled. Worse, the water sources marked on her father's maps were proving unreliable. Streams that should have been flowing were dry beds filled with cracked mud. Springs that had sustained travelers for generations had apparently shifted or dried up entirely. Mercy found herself rationing her water more severely with each passing day, taking smaller and smaller sips from her diminishing supply, while the relentless sun beat down on the exposed terrain around her. On the fourth day, hunger joined thirst. As a constant companion, the provisions she'd brought were running low, and her attempts at hunting small game with her father's old rifle had been unsuccessful. She wasn't a bad shot, but ammunition was precious, and the rabbits and prairie dogs that populated the Badlands seemed to have an uncanny ability to disappear just when she'd lined up what looked like a perfect shot. The fifth day brought the kind of despair that Mercy had been fighting off since leaving Deadwood. Her water was nearly gone, her food was reduced to a handful of hardtack and some dried jerky that was so tough she could barely chew it, and her careful navigation was being undermined by terrain that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at it. Worse, the weather was turning. Clouds were building on the horizon, promising either the blessing of rain or the curse of an early blizzard. On the sixth day, the clouds delivered both promises and threats in equal measure. Rain began falling in the early morning, a cold, driving precipitation that soaked through Mercy's clothes and made every step a struggle against slippery footing and reduced visibility. But the rain also meant water, and Mercy used every container she possessed to collect the precious liquid, drinking her fill for the first time in days and refilling her canteen and water bottles. The blessing became a curse when the rain turned to sleet and then to snow as the day progressed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of 2 hours, and Mercy found herself struggling through increasingly difficult terrain while her wet clothes began to freeze against her skin. The weight of her pack seemed to double with the added moisture, and her boots, which had served her well on dry ground, became treacherous liabilities on the snow-slicked rocks and clay. By evening of the 6th day, Mercy knew she was in serious trouble. Her fire-building skills, adequate in fair weather, proved insufficient against the combination of wet wood and driving snow. She managed to get a small flame started using her carefully hoarded supply of dry tinder, but the fire barely generated enough heat to warm her hands, let alone dry her clothes or cook a proper meal. That night, huddled in what little shelter she could find beneath an overhanging rock formation, Mercy faced the possibility that her grand plan had been nothing more than the foolish pride of a 16-year-old girl who didn't know enough about the world to recognize her own limitations. She thought about her parents, probably warm and safe in Missouri by now, and wondered if they would ever learn what had happened to their stubborn daughter who'd chosen pride over prudence. But as the storm raged around her makeshift shelter, Mercy also thought about Daniel waiting at Fort Laramie, probably wondering why he hadn't heard from his family in months. She thought about Cornelius Vance, no doubt assuming that she'd crawled back to beg for his generous employment offer by now. She thought about all the people who'd written off the Blackwood family as another casualty of economic hardship and frontier pragmatism. Those thoughts, bitter as they were, rekindled the anger that had sustained her through the worst moments of the past month. She was not going to die in this godforsaken wilderness just to prove Vance right about her foolishness. She was not going to become another cautionary tale told around frontier hearths about young people who didn't know their place. She was going to reach Fort Laramie, reunite with her brother, and build something better from the ashes of everything her family had lost. The 7th day dawned clear and bitterly cold, with a foot of snow covering terrain that had been merely difficult before becoming nearly impassable. Mercy's supplies were exhausted, except for a few ounces of water and a single piece of jerky that she was saving for absolute desperation. Her clothes were still damp from the previous day's rain, and ice had formed in her hair and eyebrows during the night, but the clear skies meant she could navigate more accurately, and the snow reflected enough sunlight to warm her slightly as she struggled through the drifts. Using her father's compass and her best judgment about the terrain, Mercy estimated that she was perhaps 30 miles from Fort Laramie, close enough that she might reach safety if she could maintain her pace for another 2 days. That optimism lasted until mid-afternoon, when exhaustion and malnutrition finally caught up with her determined spirit. The combination of 7 days of inadequate food, dehydration despite the previous day's rain, and the physical demands of traveling through increasingly difficult terrain had pushed her body beyond its limits. Mercy felt the weakness creeping up on her gradually, like a tide that advanced 1 inch at a time until suddenly the water was over her head. Her steps became shorter and less steady. Her vision began to blur around the edges. The weight of her pack, manageable for hundreds of miles, suddenly felt like it might drag her to the ground with every step. She tried to rally her strength by thinking about Daniel, about the warm barracks and hot food waiting at Fort Laramie, about the satisfaction of proving every doubter wrong by succeeding against impossible odds. But her body had moved beyond the reach of willpower and determination. Her muscles were consuming themselves for fuel, her blood sugar had dropped to dangerous levels, and her core temperature was beginning the slow slide toward hypothermia. The end came suddenly, as it often does for travelers who push themselves beyond all reasonable limits. Mercy topped a small rise and found herself looking down into a valley where ancient rock formations stood like monuments to some forgotten civilization. The sight was so beautiful and so unexpected after days of monotonous Badlands that she stopped walking and simply stared, forgetting for a moment the desperate nature of her situation. That moment of inattention cost her the last reserves of strength she'd been hoarding for emergencies. Her knees buckled without warning, sending her tumbling down the slope toward the valley floor. She managed to throw her pack clear and protect her head with her arms, but the fall jarred every bone in her body and left her sprawled at the base of the slope with no strength left to stand. Mercy lay there for several minutes, waiting for her strength to return, waiting for the spinning in her head to stop, waiting for some sign that her body was ready to continue the fight. But as the sun continued its relentless arc across the sky and shadows began to lengthen around the rock formations, she realized with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion like a knife that she was not going to get up again. This was where the journey ended, not at Fort Laramie, with a triumphant reunion with her brother, but in a nameless valley in the Badlands, where her bones would bleach white under the prairie sun, and no one would ever know what had become of the last of the Blackwood family. As consciousness began to slip away from her like water running through her fingers, Mercy's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone, someday, would find her father's compass and maps and put them to better use than she had managed. And then the darkness closed over her like a blanket, and the Badlands claimed another victim of human ambition and frontier, unforgiving truth. The sacred burial ground had been undisturbed for 3 generations, its ancient stones arranged in patterns that told stories older than the white man's presence in the Badlands. Here, among weathered monuments to Modoc warriors and medicine women, the spirits of the ancestors watched over their descendants with eternal vigilance. It was here, in this most hallowed of places, that the unconscious form of a white girl now lay sprawled like a broken doll against the red earth. Ayanna had been tracking the girl's progress for 2 days, moving like smoke through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced warriors. At 42, he was no longer the young hothead who had earned his war name Shadow Walker during the bloody conflicts with the cavalry 15 years ago. Time and exile had taught him patience, observation, and the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving when survival seems impossible. But nothing in his long experience of watching desperate travelers cross the Badlands had prepared him for the sight of this particular wayfarer. She was impossibly young, perhaps 16 summers, with hair the color of autumn wheat and skin burned. Robbed by exposure to elements that showed no mercy to the inexperienced, more troubling than her youth was her destination. For 2 days, Ayanna had watched her struggle through terrain that would test seasoned scouts, following a route that would take her directly through the heart of Modoc's sacred lands. No white person had set foot in these valleys for over a decade, not since the last of the failed peace treaties had driven his people deeper into the wilderness. The girl's collapse beside the ancestor stones was no accident, Ayanna realized, as he studied her motionless form from the concealment of the rock formations above. The spirits had guided her here, to this place where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the ancestors grew thin. But why? What purpose could the spirits have for bringing a dying white child to the most sacred ground of a people? Ayanna descended from his vantage point with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among both his own people and the cavalry officers who had hunted him through these same canyons years ago. Up close, the girl looked even more fragile than she had from a distance. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her lips cracked and bloodless from dehydration. Her clothes, once of good quality, were torn and stained beyond recognition. But it was her hands that told the real story of her journey, hands that bore the calluses of honest work, not the soft palms of pampered Eastern wealth. Beside her lay a canvas pack that had been carefully repaired multiple times, its contents spilled across the ground from her tumbling fall down the slope. Ayana examined the scattered belongings with the thoroughness of a man whose survival had always depended on reading the truth of situations quickly and accurately. A compass of excellent craftsmanship, its brass case worn smooth by decades of use, maps drawn with the precision of someone who understood the deadly importance of accurate navigation. A leather journal filled with writing in a neat, educated hand, medical remedies and treatments that showed genuine knowledge, not superstition. Most telling of all was a small photograph wrapped carefully in oilcloth showing a family of 4, standing proudly in front of what appeared to be a frontier general store. The girl in the photograph, younger and healthier but unmistakably the same person who now lay unconscious before him, stood between a man and woman whose faces reflected the kind of quiet dignity that Ayana had learned to respect during his years of watching white settlers. These were not the soft, greedy people who had driven his tribe from their ancestral lands. These were workers, survivors, people who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. The girl stirred slightly, mumbling words that Ayana couldn't quite catch, but her breathing remained dangerously shallow, and her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that preceded death from exposure and starvation. She would not survive another night in the open, not in her current condition. The temperature was already dropping as evening approached, and the clear skies that had followed yesterday's storm promised a bitter cold that would finish what the journey had started. Ayana found himself facing a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. For 15 years, he had lived in complete isolation from the white world, maintaining his exile from both societies with the discipline of a man who had chosen his path deliberately and without regret. He had watched wagon trains struggle past. In the distance, had observed the occasional lost traveler or prospector stumble through the outer edges of his territory. But he had never intervened. The spirits had given him sanctuary in these sacred lands, but that sanctuary came with the understanding that he would remain invisible, a ghost haunting the margins of both worlds. But the girl's presence here, in this most sacred of places, suggested that the spirits had other plans. Ayana had learned long ago to read the signs that others missed, to understand the subtle messages that the natural world constantly provided to those wise enough to listen. The fact that she had collapsed beside the ancestor stones, that her journey had brought her to the exact center of Modoc sacred territory, that she carried the tools and knowledge of someone who might actually survive if given proper care. None of this was coincidence. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like the inevitable unfolding of a destiny that had been set in motion long before either of them had been born. Ayana gathered the girl's scattered belongings, securing them in her pack with the careful attention of someone who understood that every possession might be crucial to survival. Then, with movements as gentle as those he might use to handle an injured fawn, he lifted her unconscious form and began the careful journey to his hidden camp. The path to Ayana's sanctuary wound through a maze of canyons and hidden passages that he had spent years learning and perfecting. No white man had ever seen this route, and few among his own people knew of its existence. It was a path that required perfect knowledge of handholds and footing, where a single misstep could send the unwary tumbling into crevasses that would swallow them without trace. Carrying the additional weight of an unconscious person made the journey exponentially more dangerous, but Ayana moved with the confidence of absolute familiarity. His camp, when they finally reached it, was a marvel of concealment and practical engineering that reflected 15 years of patient development. Built into a natural cave system that had been expanded and modified over time, it was invisible from any angle unless you knew exactly where to look. Fresh water flowed from a spring that emerged from deep within the rock formation, and carefully Tended gardens grew in terraced plots that caught and held every precious drop of rain. Solar heating from strategically placed rock formations kept the temperature comfortable even during the harshest winter weather, while smoke from cooking fires was dispersed through a network of natural chimneys that prevented detection from any distance. Ayana laid the girl on a bed of soft furs in the cave's main chamber, then immediately began the careful work of assessment and treatment that would determine whether his intervention had come in time to save her life. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. Most critically, her core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and warming her too quickly could cause as much damage as leaving her cold. Working with the patience of someone who had learned medical skills through years of treating injuries and illnesses without access to white man's medicine, Ayana began the slow process of bringing her back from the edge of death. Warm broth, administered drop by drop to avoid overwhelming her damaged digestive system. Heated stones, wrapped in soft leather to gradually raise her body temperature without causing shock. Herbal preparations designed to combat dehydration and restore the mineral balance that her body desperately needed. As he worked, Ayana found himself remembering another time, another place, when he had performed similar ministrations for someone whose life hung in the balance. Makawi, his wife, dying slowly from the lung sickness that the white man's diseases had brought to their people. He had tried everything then, traditional remedies, desperate trips to white settlements to steal medicine, prayers and offerings to every spirit that might have the power to intervene. But modern medicine had been beyond his reach, and traditional treatments had been inadequate against diseases that his people had never encountered before. Makawi had died in his arms on a night much like this one, her breath growing shallower with each passing hour, until finally it stopped altogether. He had buried her according to Modoc tradition, then walked away from everything he had ever known, choosing exile over the constant reminder of his failure to save the person who mattered most to him in the world. Now, 15 years later, he found himself once again fighting death for the life of someone who should have been a stranger. But as he watched the girl's color slowly improve under his careful treatment, as her breathing deepened and steadied, Ayana began to understand that perhaps this was not coincidence but completion. Perhaps the spirits had brought her here not just to test his commitment to isolation, but to offer him a chance at redemption that he had never expected to receive. The girl slept deeply for 18 hours, her body finally able to rest and recover, under the protection of shelter, warmth, and proper medical care. When she finally began to stir, Ayana was ready with water and a thin soup made from rabbit and wild vegetables. He had positioned himself where she could see him clearly when she opened her eyes, knowing that the first moments of consciousness would be crucial in determining how she reacted to finding herself in the care of a man her people had been taught to fear. Mercy Blackwood opened her eyes slowly, her vision swimming as consciousness returned in gradual waves. The first thing she noticed was warmth, blessed, life-giving warmth that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. The second was the soft glow of firelight dancing on stone walls, creating an atmosphere of safety and comfort that seemed impossible after the harsh realities of the Badlands. The third was the man sitting quietly beside her bed, watching her with dark eyes that held depths of knowledge and experience far beyond anything she had ever encountered. He was Native American. That much was immediately obvious from his features and the traditional clothing he wore. But beyond that, Mercy found it difficult to categorize him according to the stereotypes that frontier society had taught her to expect. He was neither the noble savage of romantic literature, nor the bloodthirsty warrior of penny dreadfuls. He was simply a man, perhaps in his 40s, with graying hair braided in traditional fashion and hands that showed the calluses of someone accustomed to both hard work and precise craftsmanship. "You are safe," he said quietly, his English perfect but accented with the rhythms of another language. "You collapsed near the sacred places of my people. The spirits guided me to find you before the cold could finish what the hunger had started." Mercy tried to sit up, but dizziness immediately forced her back down to the furs. How long have I been here?" "Nearly 2 days. Your body was very close to giving up its fight. Another few hours in the cold, and even the spirits would not have been able to call you back." The reality of her situation began to sink in gradually. She was alive when she should have been dead, warm and safe when she should have been freezing in the wilderness, in the care of someone who had every reason to consider her an enemy. "Why did you help me?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Your people and mine. We're not exactly friends." Ayana considered the question for a long moment before answering. "The spirits do not recognize the boundaries that men draw on their maps," he said finally. "They see suffering and respond to it, regardless of the color of skin or the language. Of prayers, you were brought to our sacred places for a reason, though I do not yet understand what that reason might be." Mercy studied his face, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives and finding none. Everything about him radiated a kind of calm competence that reminded her of her father at his best, someone who had learned to read situations accurately and respond appropriately regardless of personal feelings or prejudices. "My name is Mercy. Blackwood," she said finally. "I was trying to reach Fort Laramie. My brother's stationed there with the cavalry." "I know of this fort," Ayana replied. "It is still many days' travel from here, even for someone in good health and properly equipped." The weight of her situation hit Mercy like a physical blow. She had been so focused on simply surviving each day of her journey that she hadn't fully considered what would happen if she failed to reach her destination. Now lying helpless in the cave of a man whose people had every reason to hate hers, she was forced to confront the possibility that her grand plan had been doomed from the beginning. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted the words, coming out more quietly than she had intended. "My family lost everything to a man who bought up our debts and foreclosed on our store. My parents went back east, but She trailed off, realizing how foolish her reasoning must sound to someone who had obviously survived much worse hardships. "But you chose to walk 200 miles through the Badlands rather than accept defeat," Ayana finished for her. There was no mockery in his voice, only a kind of understanding that surprised her. This shows either great courage or great foolishness, perhaps both. Despite everything, Mercy found herself smiling slightly. "My father always said those two things were closer related than most people like to admit." "Your father sounds like a wise man. The fact that you survived 7 days in country that kills experienced travelers suggests that his wisdom was not wasted on you." Over the next few hours, as Mercy's strength slowly returned under Ayana's careful ministrations, she found herself sharing more of her story than she had intended. There was something about his quiet presence that invited confidence, a sense that here was someone who had also known loss and hardship intimate enough to understand without judging. She told him about the Blackwood family's 3 generations in Deadwood Gulch, about her parents' decision to mortgage everything to help their neighbors during the diphtheria outbreak, about Cornelius Vance's systematic destruction of local businesses, and her own refusal to accept his degrading employment offer. She spoke of her brother Daniel and her hopes of starting over at Fort Laramie, of her determination to prove that the Blackwood family would not go quietly into obscurity. Ayana listened without interrupting, occasionally asking quiet questions that showed he understood not just the facts of her story, but the emotional currents that had driven her to make such a desperate choice. When she finished, he sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before speaking. "Your journey to Fort Laramie is not finished," he said finally, "but it cannot continue until you are strong enough to survive the remaining distance. The Badlands do not offer second chances to those who challenge them without proper preparation." "How long?" Mercy asked. "How long before I'm strong enough to continue?" Ayana studied her carefully, obviously weighing factors that went beyond simple physical recovery. "If you rest properly and follow my guidance for rebuilding your strength, perhaps 2 weeks. Maybe 3, but there are other considerations beyond your health." "What kind of considerations?" "Winter comes early to this country, and it shows no mercy to travelers caught in the open. The wise course would be to wait until spring before attempting to complete your journey." The thought of spending an entire winter as a dependent on someone who owed her nothing was almost unbearable, but Mercy was beginning to understand that her choices had been narrowed considerably by her current circumstances. "And you would allow me to stay here that long? The spirits brought you to our sacred places for a reason," Ayana repeated. "Until that reason becomes clear, you will remain under their protection. And mine." That night, as Mercy lay on her bed of soft furs, listening to the wind howling through the canyons outside, she reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she'd been ready to die alone in the wilderness, convinced that her stubborn pride had finally led her beyond the reach of help or hope. Now she was safe and warm in the hidden sanctuary of a man whose people her own government had declared enemies, receiving care and protection that she had no right to expect. She thought about the stories she had heard around frontier hearths, tales of savage Indians who tortured captives and showed no mercy to white settlers. Those stories seemed not just wrong, but maliciously false, when measured against the reality of Ayana's quiet competence and genuine concern for her welfare. Whatever else he might be, he was neither savage nor merciless. He was simply a man who had chosen to live according to principles that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and nationality. But Mercy also understood that accepting his protection came with obligations that went beyond simple gratitude. She was now entangled in a situation that could have profound consequences for both of them if discovered by the outside world. A white girl living in the camp of an exiled Modoc warrior would be seen as either a captive to be rescued or a traitor, to be punished, depending on who found them first. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead Mercy found it oddly liberating. For the first time since her family's downfall had begun, she was free from the expectations and prejudices of white frontier society. Here, in this hidden sanctuary, she could simply be herself without worrying about how her choices might reflect on her family's reputation or her own prospects for a respectable future. As sleep finally claimed her, Mercy's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided Ayana to find her beside the ancestor stones. She had set out from Deadwood Gulch, hoping to reach Fort Laramie and reunite with her brother. Instead, she had found something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous, a chance to discover who she really was, when stripped of everything she had thought defined her identity. In the darkness of the cave, Ayana sat watch beside the dying fire, his mind turning over questions that had no easy answers. The girl's presence here would change everything he knew. 15 years of careful isolation were about to come to an end, one way or another. The only question was whether that change would bring salvation or destruction to them both. 3. Weeks had passed since Ayana had carried Mercy's unconscious form from the sacred burial ground, and the hidden sanctuary had transformed from a place of solitary exile into something resembling a home. The change was subtle but profound, like the difference between a cave that sheltered one lost soul and a dwelling that nurtured two people learning to trust each other against all the odds that history and circumstance had stacked against them. Mercy, had proven to be a surprisingly adaptable student of wilderness survival, absorbing Ayana's lessons with the quick intelligence of someone who understood that knowledge meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. She had learned to tend the carefully concealed gardens that provided their vegetables, to prepare the medicinal teas that Ayana brewed from plants she was slowly learning to identify, and to move through the cave system with the quiet efficiency that was essential for maintaining their invisibility from the outside world. More importantly, she had proven herself useful in ways that went beyond simply avoiding being a burden. Her mother's medical knowledge, combined with her own quick mind and steady hands, had made her invaluable when Ayana had developed a fever after being caught in an early blizzard while hunting. For 3 days, she had nursed him through the kind of illness that could easily prove fatal to someone living alone in the wilderness, using a combination of frontier remedies and traditional Modoc healing practices that she absorbed with remarkable speed. The experience had marked a turning point in their relationship, shifting it from rescuer and rescued to something more complex and mutually dependent. Ayana had spent 15 years in complete self-reliance, trusting no one and depending on nothing beyond his own skills and knowledge. Having someone else's competent hands tending to his welfare when he was too weak to care for himself had been both humbling and oddly comforting. But it was the approaching winter that would truly test whether their unlikely alliance could survive the pressures that isolation and proximity would inevitably create. The Badlands in winter were legendary for their cruelty, with temperatures that could drop to 30 below zero and blizzards that could last for weeks without respite. Even Ayana, with all his experience and preparation, found winter survival challenging when he had only himself to worry about. Adding another person to the equation multiplied both the logistical demands and the potential for disaster. The first major storm of the season arrived on a Tuesday morning with the kind of sudden violence that characterized weather in the high plains. Mercy woke to the sound of wind that seemed to be trying to tear the mountains apart, stone by stone, punctuated by the sharp crack of ice forming and reforming in the natural chimneys that carried smoke away from their fire. When she peered out through the carefully concealed entrance to their sanctuary, she could see nothing beyond a wall of swirling white that made the world beyond the cave mouth completely invisible. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked Ayana, who was calmly checking their supplies with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had weathered many such tempests. "Sometimes hours," he replied without looking up from his inventory of dried meat and preserved vegetables. "Sometimes days. Once I was trapped for nearly 2 weeks by a storm that seemed to have no end." Mercy absorbed this information with the kind of practical acceptance that she had learned was essential for frontier survival. Panic solved nothing, and worry was a luxury that people living on the margins couldn't afford. "What do we need to do to prepare?" Ayana's slight smile suggested that her question had pleased him more than dramatic concern would have. "We wait. We conserve fuel and food. We find ways to pass the time that don't require us to venture outside or make noise that might carry." Beyond the storm. The storm lasted 5 days, and during those 5 days, Mercy learned more about Ayana than she had in all the previous weeks combined. Trapped together in the confines of the cave system, with nothing to do but wait for the weather to break, they began sharing stories that went beyond the basic facts of their situations to the deeper truths of who they were and what had shaped. The Miana told her about his childhood among the Modoc people, about learning to hunt and track from his grandfather, who had been a legendary warrior during the tribe's conflicts with other native peoples long before the white settlers had arrived in significant numbers. He spoke of his education at a mission school, where he had learned to read and write English while struggling to maintain his connection to traditional Modoc culture and beliefs. Most painfully, He shared the story of Makawi, his wife, and their brief time together before the diseases brought by white settlement had swept through their people like wildfire. He described her intelligence, her skill as a healer, her dreams of bridging the gap between traditional medicine and the white man's knowledge in ways that could benefit both peoples. Her death had not just been a personal tragedy, but the destruction of a vision for a future where two cultures might learn from each other instead of destroying each other. Mercy, in turn, found herself sharing memories and dreams that she had never articulated even to herself. She spoke of the long evenings spent listening to her parents discuss the philosophical questions that arose from their work serving frontier communities. Questions about justice, charity, the obligations that people had to each other in a society where formal institutions were often inadequate or entirely absent. She told him about her mother's private doubts about the treatment of native peoples, doubts that Sarah Blackwood had, expressed only within the family because frontier communities rarely tolerated dissent from accepted views about racial hierarchies and the right of white settlement to supersede all other claims to the land. She shared her own confused feelings about the stories she had heard of Indian savagery, stories that seemed increasingly hollow when measured against the reality of Ayana's gentle competence and obvious intelligence. Most significantly, she found herself admitting that her journey to Fort Laramie had been motivated as much by a desire to escape the narrow confines of acceptable behavior for frontier women as by practical necessity. The life that awaited her at the fort, marriage to some suitable man, children, the endless round of domestic duties that defined women's existence in frontier society, had seemed increasingly confining as she had grown older and more aware of her own capabilities and interests. "I know it sounds ungrateful," she said during one of their long conversations beside the fire. "Most women would consider marriage and family to be the best possible outcome for someone in my situation. But I keep thinking about my mother. How much she knew about medicine and healing, how much good she could have done if she had been born male and allowed to become a real doctor instead of just the woman who helped when there was no one else available." Ayana listened without judgment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered her words. "Among my people," he said finally, "women can become medicine healers if they show the gift and the dedication. Gender does not determine who can serve the spirits or help the community. Perhaps your people's ways are not the only ways." The conversation marked another shift in their relationship, this one more profound than the practical partnership that had developed around survival needs. They were beginning to see each other not just as allies in the fight against the wilderness, but as kindred spirits who had both chafed against the limitations that their respective societies had tried to impose on their lives and dreams. When the storm finally broke and they emerged from the cave to survey a world transformed by snow and ice, Mercy realized that something fundamental had changed. During those 5 days of enforced intimacy, the polite distance that had characterized their early interactions had given way to something warmer and more comfortable, a sense of understanding that transcended the cultural barriers that should have made real friendship impossible. But their newfound comfort with each other was about to be tested by challenges that went far beyond weather and wilderness survival. On the second day after the storm, while checking the snares that provided much of their fresh meat, Ayana discovered tracks in the snow that made him freeze with recognition and dread. "We need to return to the cave immediately," he told Mercy, his voice carrying an urgency that she had never heard before. "And we need to be very careful about leaving any signs of our passage." Mercy had learned to trust Ayana's instincts absolutely, when it came to wilderness dangers, so she asked no questions as they made their way back to the sanctuary with the kind of painstaking attention to concealment that spoke of serious threat. Only when they were safely inside did she finally ask what had alarmed him. "Soldiers," Ayana said simply. "A patrol from Fort Laramie, probably searching for winter campsites for hostile Indians. They're 2 days away, maybe 3, but they're moving in this direction." The news hit Mercy like a physical blow. Her brother Daniel was stationed at Fort Laramie. There was a possibility, however remote, that he might be part of any patrol searching this area. The thought of encountering him under these circumstances, living in the camp of an exiled Modoc warrior, her reputation and future destroyed by association with someone her people considered an enemy, was almost unbearable. But worse than the personal implications was the realization of what discovery would mean for Ayana. The Army's policy toward Native Americans found off reservation land was harsh and unforgiving, particularly when it came to warriors with reputations like his. At best, he would be arrested and taken to a reservation where he would spend the rest of his life under military supervision. At worst, he might be shot while resisting arrest, a convenient fiction that had been used to eliminate troublesome Indians throughout the frontier. "You have to leave," Mercy said suddenly. "If they find this place, if they find you here, they'll kill you." Ayana's expression remained calm, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "And leave you here alone. Even if the soldiers don't find this cave, winter is far from over. You would not survive until spring without help." "I'll take my chances with the soldiers. I'm white, I'm a woman, they'll help me get to the fort safely. But if they find you with me—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they both understood what capture would mean for him. "There is another possibility," Ayana said slowly, obviously weighing the implications of whatever he was considering. "But it would require you to trust me completely, and it would mean giving up any chance of reaching your brother this winter." Mercy studied his face, reading the conflict between his desire to protect her and his knowledge of what that protection might cost them both. "What kind of possibility?" "There are places deeper in the Badlands where no white man has ever ventured, places where the spirits of the ancestors make the very air dangerous for those who do not belong. We could go there, wait out the winter in complete safety from discovery. But the journey would be difficult, and the isolation would be total. Once we left this place, there would be no returning until spring." The choice he was offering her was stark in its implications. Stay here and risk discovery by the patrol, with all the catastrophic consequences that would follow for both of them. Or venture deeper into the wilderness with a man who was already risking everything to protect her, trusting in his knowledge and skills to keep them both alive through the hardest months of winter. But even as Mercy considered the practical aspects of the decision, she realized that the choice went deeper than simple survival calculations. Ayana was offering her something that no one in her previous life had ever offered: complete trust, mutual dependence, a partnership between equals that ignored all the social conventions and racial prejudices that had shaped every other relationship she had ever known. "How soon would we need to leave?" she asked. "Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow night at the latest. The longer we wait, the greater the chance that the patrol will pick up our trail." Mercy looked around the cave that had been her sanctuary for nearly a month, noting the small improvements and personal touches that had made it feel like home, despite its primitive conditions. Leaving meant abandoning not just physical comfort, but the first place where she had felt truly free to be herself without apology or explanation. But staying meant risking not just her own future, but Ayana's life. And that was a price she could not bring herself to pay. What would we need to take with us? Ayana's relief was visible, though he tried to hide it behind practical concerns. Only the essentials: food, medicine, weapons, warm clothing. Everything else stays here. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for a journey that would take them farther from civilization than either of them had ever been. Ayana packed supplies with the efficiency of someone who had learned to live out of a pack during his years as a scout and warrior. Mercy sorted through her few possessions, choosing items based on utility rather than sentiment, though she carefully wrapped her family photograph and her mother's journal in oilcloth before placing them in her pack. As evening approached and the time for departure drew near, Mercy found herself standing at the entrance to the cave, looking out at the Badlands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, her brother Daniel was probably huddled around a campfire with his fellow soldiers, searching for the very people who had become her protectors and companions. Somewhere beyond the Badlands, her parents were settling into their new life in Missouri, probably assuming that their stubborn daughter had come to her senses and accepted some form of conventional employment in Deadwood Gulch. Neither her family nor the wider world had any way of knowing that Mercy Blackwood had essentially ceased to exist, replaced by someone who was learning to define herself by entirely different standards and values. "Are you ready?" Ayana asked softly, coming to stand beside her with their packs secured and their route planned. Mercy took one last look at the sanctuary that had saved her life and taught her things about herself that she had never suspected. Then she turned, away from the cave and toward the deeper wilderness, toward whatever destiny awaited them in the sacred places where few white people had ever ventured and none had ever returned to tell the tale. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They left the cave as darkness fell, moving like shadows through terrain that seemed actively hostile to human presence. Behind them, the warm glow of the fire they had kept burning for nearly a month finally died away, leaving no trace of their occupancy except memories that would fade with time. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous and unforgiving, but also free from the constraints and prejudices that had shaped both their lives until this moment. As they walked deeper into the wilderness under a sky brilliant with winter stars, Mercy realized that she was no longer the desperate girl who had collapsed beside the ancestor stones. That person had died during the long conversations beside the fire, replaced by someone stronger and more certain of her own worth, someone who could face the unknown with confidence because she was no longer facing it alone. The transformation was complete, but the real test of what they had become together was just beginning. Winter in the deep Badlands would demand everything they had learned about trust, survival, and the bonds that could form between two people who had chosen each other over the safety of their separate worlds. The sacred places of the Modoc ancestors lay ahead, shrouded in legend and protected by geography that had defeated every previous attempt at exploration. It was there, in the heart of the wilderness, that Mercy and Ayana would discover whether their unlikely alliance was strong enough to survive not just the physical challenges of winter survival, but the deeper test of whether two people from different worlds could truly build something new together. The deeper Badlands were a landscape that existed beyond the maps of white cartographers, beyond the understanding of anyone who had not been born to read the subtle signs that the ancestors had left carved into stone and wind. For 3 days, Ayana led Mercy through canyons that twisted like the thoughts of sleeping gods, past rock formations that hummed with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand upright, through passes so narrow that they had to remove their packs and squeeze through sideways, while ancient petroglyphs watched their progress with eyes that seemed to follow their movement. This was the heart of sacred Modoc territory, the place where the physical world thinned enough for the spirits. To walk among the living, Mercy could feel the difference in ways she couldn't articulate, a sense of presence that was both welcoming and warning. The very air seemed charged with significance, as if every breath carried messages from people who had walked these paths. centuries before either she or Ayana had been born. On the fourth day, they reached the place Ayana had been seeking, a hidden valley so perfectly concealed that it could only be found by someone who knew exactly where the secret entrance lay, camouflaged among the seemingly solid rock walls. The valley was impossibly green for this late in the season, warmed by hot springs that created their own microclimate and fed by streams that emerged from deep within the earth. Ancient ruins dotted the landscape, the remains of structures built by people whose names had been lost to time, but whose presence still lingered in every carefully placed stone. My grandmother's people built their winter villages here, Ayana explained as they descended into the valley through a passage so concealed that Mercy would never have found it on her own. Before the treaties, before the removals, before the world changed beyond recognition, this place has been empty for 40 years, but the spirits still remember. They established their camp in the ruins of what had once been a substantial dwelling, its stone foundations still solid after decades of abandonment. Working together with the efficiency they had developed during their weeks in the cave, they created a shelter that combined the best of traditional Modoc building techniques with practical modifications for winter survival. Mercy proved surprisingly adept at the stonework required to restore the walls, her hands steady and patient as she fitted each piece with the precision that such construction demanded. But it was during their 5th day in the valley that they encountered the challenge that would test everything they had learned about trust and survival. Ayana had gone hunting alone, tracking deer sign toward the upper reaches of the valley when he failed to return at the appointed time. As the sun began to set and shadows gathered among the ruins, Mercy realized that something had gone wrong. She found him at the base of a cliff where he had apparently fallen while pursuing wounded game, his left leg twisted at an angle that spoke of serious fracture. Worse, he was running a fever that suggested internal injuries beyond what was immediately visible. The irony was not lost on her that the man who had saved her life was now in exactly the position she had been in when he had found her beside the ancestor stones, unconscious, injured, and completely dependent on someone else's knowledge and competence for survival. But Mercy was no longer the desperate, inexperienced girl who had collapsed in the Badlands 2 months ago. Under Ayana's patient instruction, she had learned not just the basics of wilderness medicine, but the deeper principles that governed healing in traditional Modoc culture. More importantly, she had learned to trust her own judgment and abilities in ways that her previous life had never allowed or encouraged. Working through the night by the light of a carefully shielded fire, Mercy set Ayana's broken leg using techniques that combined her mother's frontier medical knowledge with traditional healing practices she had absorbed during their time together. She brewed teas from plants he had taught her to identify, following recipes that had been passed down through generations of Modoc healers. Most critically, she managed to construct a travois that would allow her to move him back to their shelter without causing further injury. The next 3 weeks tested every skill she had acquired, and some she discovered she possessed without realizing it. Ayana's injuries healed slowly, complicated by infection and the kind of complications that could easily prove fatal to someone living beyond the reach of proper medical care. Mercy found herself shouldering responsibilities that would have terrified her just months ago, hunting for fresh meat when their supplies ran low, maintaining their shelter against increasingly harsh weather, making life-or-death medical decisions based on incomplete knowledge and desperate hope. But more than practical challenges, those weeks forced both of them to confront the depth of the bond that had developed between them. Caring for someone in complete vulnerability, being trusted with another person's life when failure meant not just disappointment, but death, created an intimacy that went far beyond anything either of them had experienced in their previous relationships. During The long nights when Ayana's fever spiked and Mercy sat beside him applying cool cloths and monitoring his breathing, she found herself confronting feelings that frontier society had given her no framework for understanding. This was not the romantic love of penny novels or the practical affection of arranged frontier marriages. This was something deeper and more complex, built on mutual respect and shared hardship and the kind of trust that could only be earned through repeated proof of character under impossible circumstances. Ayana, for his part, discovered that accepting help from someone he had come to care about was far more difficult than providing it. 15 years of complete self-reliance had not prepared him for the vulnerability of depending on another person for survival, particularly someone whose competence he had initially doubted despite his willingness to protect her. Watching Mercy shoulder responsibilities that would challenge experienced frontiersmen, seeing her grow into capabilities she had never been allowed to develop in her previous life, forced him to acknowledge that his initial assessment of her as simply another lost white settler had been profoundly wrong. The turning point came during the 4th week of his recovery, when a late-season blizzard trapped them in their rebuilt dwelling for 6 straight days. Confined together in a space barely large enough for 2 people, unable to venture outside for any reason, they talked with the kind of complete honesty that extreme circumstances sometimes make possible. Mercy spoke for the first time about the loneliness that had characterized her life in Deadwood Gulch, the sense that she was always performing a role rather than being allowed to discover who she actually was beneath the expectations that frontier society placed on young women. She admitted that her decision to reject Cornelius Vance's employment offer had been motivated as much by a desire to escape those limitations as by pride or practical considerations. Ayana, in turn, shared memories of Macawy that he had never spoken aloud before, describing not just his grief at her death, but his guilt at feeling that their love had been incomplete, that they had never moved beyond the formal courtship patterns of traditional Modoc culture to the kind of deep partnership that he had always believed marriage should be. He spoke of his regret that they had never had the chance to know each other as equals, to build something together that reflected both their individual strengths and their shared vision for the future. The conversation that followed was conducted largely in silences, punctuated by words that carried more weight than either of them had intended. They were acknowledging feelings that had been growing for weeks, feelings that transcended the practical, partnership that had kept them alive, and moved into territory that was both more dangerous and more promising than either had expected when they first began their winter exile together. When the storm finally broke and they emerged into a world transformed once again by snow and ice, something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful politeness that had characterized even their most intimate conversations had given way to the kind of comfortable familiarity that usually took years to develop. They moved around each other in their small space with an awareness of shared purpose that went beyond simple cooperation. But their newfound understanding was about to be tested by a discovery that would force them to confront not just their feelings for each other, but the impossible position that those feelings created, given the realities of the world beyond their hidden valley. While checking the snares that provided much of their winter protein, Mercy discovered something that made her blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the snow, and not the unshod hooves of wild ponies. These were the tracks of cavalry mounts, meaning that the military patrol they had fled from had somehow managed to follow their trail deeper into the Badlands than anyone had thought possible. Worse, the tracks were recent, probably made within the past day, and they led directly toward the concealed entrance to their sanctuary valley. Either through exceptional tracking skills or sheer persistence, the soldiers had managed to penetrate territory that no white man had ever explored, and they were now dangerously close to discovering the hidden refuge that had protected not Just Ayana, but generations of his people before him. When Mercy brought the news back to Ayana, still weak from his injuries, but mobile enough to understand the implications of what she had found, they both realized that their time of peaceful isolation was coming to an end. The outside world, with all its complications and prejudices and impossible choices, was closing in on them whether they were ready for it or not. "How many?" Ayana asked, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "Hard to tell from the tracks. At least 6, maybe 8. Well armed and well supplied. From the look of their equipment." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, obviously weighing options that all carried serious risks. "My leg is strong enough for travel, but not for the kind of movement we would need to evade a determined pursuit. And there are no other refugees within reach that could shelter us through the rest of winter." Mercy understood what he was not saying directly. If they were discovered here, there would be no escape. Ayana, despite his injuries, would fight rather than surrender, and that fight would almost certainly be his last. She would be rescued by soldiers who would see her months of living with a Modoc warrior as evidence of either captivity or treason, and either interpretation would destroy any chance of the life she had been trying to build. But as she looked around the valley that had become their home, at the ruins where they had built something together that was more precious than either of them had dared to hope for, Mercy realized that the approaching soldiers represented more than just personal danger. They threatened to destroy not just their refuge, but the possibility they represented. The chance that two people from different worlds could find common ground and build something beautiful together, despite all the forces arrayed against them. Choice that lay ahead would test everything they had learned about trust, sacrifice, and the kind of love that was strong enough to survive in a world determined to tear it apart. And the decision they made would determine not just their own fates, but whether the bridge they had built between their peoples would survive to inspire others or be destroyed by the same prejudices and fears that had already claimed so many. Lives on both sides of the cultural divide. The cavalry patrol reached the valley's hidden entrance at dawn, their movements betraying the exhaustion of men who had pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits in pursuit of a quarry they barely understood. Lieutenant Daniel Blackwood led the column with the grim determination of a man whose personal stake in the mission went far beyond military duty. For 3 months he had carried the weight of not knowing what had become of his sister, the brilliant and stubborn girl who had vanished from Deadwood Gulch like smoke in the wind. The official mission was routine: locate and arrest hostile Indians reported to be wintering in the deep Badlands, a standard operation that Daniel had carried out dozens of times without particular enthusiasm or personal investment. But when the description of the missing persons had included a young white woman, possibly taken captive, Daniel's blood had turned to ice in his veins. The timing, the location, the circumstances all pointed to a possibility that he could barely bring himself to consider. Behind Daniel rode Sergeant Murphy, a 20-year veteran whose weathered face showed the kind of skepticism that came from following too many wild theories into too many empty canyons. The men were tired, their supplies running low, and the weather was turning ugly with the promise of another storm that could trap them in the Badlands until spring. Every practical consideration argued for turning back, but Daniel's driving urgency had pushed them deeper into unmapped territory than any military patrol had ever ventured. "Sir," Murphy said quietly as they approached what appeared to be another dead-end canyon, "the men are starting to question the wisdom of this pursuit. We're 3 days past our turnaround point, and winter storms in this country don't give second chances." Daniel understood the sergeant's concerns, shared them even, but the alternative was unthinkable. "One more day, Sergeant. If we don't find anything by tomorrow evening, we'll begin the return journey." What Daniel didn't know was that his sister was at that moment watching their approach from a concealed position among the rocks above the valley entrance. Mercy had been maintaining surveillance since discovering the cavalry tracks, and the sight of her brother leading the patrol had hit her like a physical blow. All the careful rationalization she had constructed about her new life, all the justifications for the choices she had made, crumbled in the face of seeing Daniel's familiar form outlined against the morning sky. She made her way back to their shelter, where Ayana was preparing for what they both understood might be their final stand. His leg was still weak, but he could move well enough to fight, and fight he would, rather than allow himself to be taken alive. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. The brother Mercy had been trying to reach when she began her desperate journey was now the greatest threat to everything she had found in the wilderness. "It's Daniel," she said simply, as she entered their dwelling. "My brother is leading the patrol." Ayana paused in checking his rifle, understanding immediately the full implications of what she had discovered. "This changes everything. If he's here looking for you specifically, he won't be deterred by the usual tactics." Mercy sank down beside their fire, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to tragedy. "If they find us together, if Daniel sees me here with you, it will destroy him. He'll blame himself for failing to protect me, and he'll never understand that I chose this life freely. And if they take me alive," Ayana added quietly, "I'll be used as proof that his sister was defiled by savages, even if you tell them the truth about our relationship. Your reputation will be destroyed, and mine will be irrelevant, because I'll be hanged as a kidnapper and rapist regardless of the facts." The brutal honesty of their situation settled over them like a shroud. There was no outcome that preserved both their lives and their dignity. The world beyond the valley had no framework for understanding what they had built together, no category for a relationship that transcended racial boundaries without involving conquest or victimization. But as they sat in the dwelling they had rebuilt together, surrounded by the evidence of their partnership and the life they had created in defiance of all expectations, Mercy found herself thinking not about what they might lose, but about what they had already achieved. For 4 months, they had proven that love could exist without ownership, that two people from different worlds could build something beautiful together if they were willing to see past the artificial barriers that society had constructed. "There is another way," she said slowly, an idea taking shape that was either brilliant or completely insane. "What if we don't hide from them? What if we meet them openly and tell them the truth?" Ayana looked at her as if she had suggested they simply leap from the nearest cliff. "Mercy, these are soldiers who have been trained to see my people as enemies. They won't listen to explanations, and they won't care about the truth of our relationship. They'll listen to Daniel," Mercy insisted. "He's my brother, and he loves me. If I can make him understand that I'm here by choice, that you saved my life and treated me with honor, maybe we can find a solution that doesn't end with one of us dead. And if you're wrong, if he refuses to listen, or if his men override his judgment—" Mercy met his eyes, seeing in them the same desperate hope that she felt in her own heart. "Then at least we'll face whatever comes together as equals, instead of dying as fugitives in a cave." The decision, once made, required careful planning. They could not simply walk out of the valley and hope for the best. Too much depended on controlling the circumstances of their first contact with the patrol. Instead, they would arrange a meeting that gave Daniel the best possible chance to understand the situation before his military training and social conditioning could override his personal feelings. Mercy wrote a letter that took her 3 attempts to get right, explaining as clearly as she could the circumstances that had brought her to the valley and the relationship that had developed between her and Ayana. She described his character, his honor, his sacrifice in protecting her through the winter when he could have simply left her to die. Most importantly, she made it clear that she was writing of her own free will, and that any attempt to rescue her would be a betrayal of everything she had learned about herself during their time together. The letter was delivered to the patrol's camp by a method that Ayana had learned during his years as a scout, tied to an arrow and shot into the ground near their sentries during the pre-dawn darkness when visibility was limited. The message was clear. They were being watched by someone who could have killed them all if that had been the intention, but who instead chose communication over violence. Daniel's reaction to the letter was everything Mercy had hoped for and feared. Relief that his sister was alive warred with confusion about her circumstances and growing anger at what he initially assumed was a case of Stockholm Syndrome, a captive who had been manipulated into defending her captor. But as he read and reread her words, the voice that came through was unmistakably that of the strong-willed, intelligent woman he had known all his life, not a broken victim parroting her captor's instructions. The meeting was arranged for neutral ground, a clearing halfway between the patrol's camp and the valley entrance, with both sides understanding that weapons would be present but not drawn unless absolutely necessary. Mercy and Ayana approached on foot, hands visible and movements deliberate, while Daniel advanced with two of his most trusted men, while the rest of the patrol maintained a defensive perimeter. The first moments were the most dangerous, as 20 years of military conditioning and racial prejudice clashed with Daniel's love for his sister and his growing recognition that the situation was not what he had expected. Ayana stood beside Mercy with quiet dignity, his bearing that of a man who was prepared to die for his principles, but who preferred to live for them if possible. "Mercy," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotions he was struggling to control. Are you truly here of your own choice?" "I am," she replied, her own voice steady despite the tears she was fighting back. "Daniel, this man saved my life when I was dying in the Badlands. He protected me through the winter when he could have easily left me to freeze. Everything I told you in the letter is true." Daniel's eyes moved to Ayana, seeing not the savage he had been expecting, but a man whose calm competence and obvious intelligence challenged every stereotype he had been taught to accept. "And you," he said, addressing Ayana directly. "What do you want from my sister?" "Nothing that she does not freely choose to give," Ayana replied in English that was both precise and dignified. "I ask only that you judge me by my actions toward her, not by the color of my skin or the uniform you wear." For several long minutes the clearing was silent, except for the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a hawk circling. Overhead, Daniel was wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about duty, honor, and the proper relationship between whites and Indians. His sister was asking him to accept not just that she had survived among people he had been trained to consider enemies, but that she had found love and partnership that transcended all the boundaries that frontier society considered sacred. The decision that Daniel made in that moment would determine not just the fate of his sister and the man she loved, but the kind of person he would be for the rest of his life. He could follow military protocol and arrest Ayana, rescue his sister from a situation that his training told him was inherently wrong regardless of her protests. Or he could trust in the evidence of his own eyes and the voice of the woman he had raised as much as their parents had, accepting that love and honor could exist in forms that his world had never imagined. "Sergeant Murphy," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a decision that would be impossible to reverse. "Make note in the patrol log that our search for hostile Indians has been unsuccessful. We found no evidence of unauthorized native presence in this area." Murphy's eyebrows rose slightly, but 20 years of military service had taught him when to ask questions and when to simply follow orders. "Yes, sir. Shall I order the men to prepare for return to the fort?" "But shall. We'll begin the journey back tomorrow morning." Daniel turned back to his sister, his expression a mixture of love, concern, and acceptance that he was clearly still struggling to fully embrace. "I won't pretend to understand everything about your situation, Mercy, but I can see that you're safe, and that's what matters most. When spring comes, if you want to visit the fort, if you want to write to our parents, the opportunity will be there." Mercy stepped forward and embraced her brother, tears flowing freely now that the immediate danger had passed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." As the patrol prepared to leave the Badlands, carrying with them a secret that would never appear in any official report, Mercy and Ayana returned to their valley, knowing that they had achieved something that seemed impossible just hours before. They had faced the outside world on their own terms and emerged with their relationship intact and their dignity preserved. But more than personal victory, they had proven that understanding could exist across racial lines when people were willing to look beyond stereotypes and prejudices to see the humanity in each other. Daniel's choice to trust his sister's judgment over his military training represented a crack in the wall of hatred and misunderstanding that divided their peoples, a small hope that perhaps the future might hold possibilities for peace that the present could barely imagine. Winter was far from over, and many challenges still lay ahead, but they would face them together as equals, with the knowledge that love had proven stronger than prejudice and that honor could exist in forms that the world had never expected to see. Spring arrived in the sacred valley like a whispered promise finally kept, transforming the landscape. From winter's harsh monochrome into a tapestry of impossible green dotted with wildflowers that seemed to have been painted by the spirits themselves. The hot springs that had sustained Mercy and Ayana through the bitter months now fed streams that sang with snowmelt, carrying the music of renewal through canyons that had echoed with only silence and wind during the long season of endurance. 5 months had passed since Daniel's patrol had departed, carrying with them a secret that had somehow made the world both smaller and infinitely larger. In those months, Mercy and Ayana had built something that went far beyond simple survival or even love as frontier society understood it. They had created a partnership that honored both their cultures while transcending the limitations of either, a daily demonstration that understanding could bridge any divide when people were willing to meet each other as equals. The dwelling they shared had evolved from a shelter rebuilt from ancient ruins into something that truly deserved to be called home. Mercy's practical frontier skills combined with Ayana's traditional knowledge had produced innovations that would have impressed engineers from either culture. Solar heating systems based on Modoc principles but enhanced with techniques her father had learned from German immigrants, water management that combined European hydraulics with native understanding of seasonal flows, gardens that grew food plants from both traditions, creating a cuisine that reflected their blended heritage. But the most significant changes were not visible in their physical surroundings, but in themselves. Mercy had grown into the woman her mother had always hoped she might become: strong, independent, skilled in healing arts that drew from multiple traditions, comfortable with her own authority in ways that frontier society had never allowed. Her medical knowledge now encompassed not just frontier remedies and book learning, but the deep spiritual understanding of healing that traditional Modoc culture had developed over centuries. Ayana, for his part, had rediscovered parts of himself that 15 years of exile had forced him to suppress. The teacher, the bridge builder, the man who had once dreamed of finding ways for different peoples to learn from each other rather than destroy each other. Mercy's presence had reminded him that isolation, however necessary for survival, was not the same as peace, and that some kinds of healing required connection rather than solitude. Their relationship had deepened through the winter, into something that neither of their cultures had adequate language to describe. It was marriage in the deepest sense, a true partnership of equals who had chosen each other freely and built something together that was stronger than either could achieve alone. But it was also a daily choice to love across boundaries that the outside world considered unbridgeable, a living proof that the human heart recognized no authorities except truth and courage. The question that had haunted them both as winter began to release its grip was what would come next. Spring meant that travel would once again be possible, that the outside world, with all its complications and prejudices, would become accessible. Daniel's acceptance had given them hope, but one man's enlightened choice could not change the attitudes of entire societies. Sooner or later, they would have to decide whether to remain hidden in their valley sanctuary or venture back into a world that had no place for what they represented. The answer came in the form of a visitor that neither of them had expected. Dr. Margaret Walsh arrived at their valley in early April, traveling with a small escort of trusted guides who had sworn oaths of secrecy that they took more seriously than military regulations. Dr. Walsh was a woman whose reputation in frontier medicine was matched only by her scandalous disregard for social conventions that limited what women were supposed to accomplish. She had come at Daniel's invitation, carrying supplies and a proposal that offered possibilities neither Mercy nor Ayana had dared to imagine. Dr. Walsh needed an assistant. For a new medical mission she was establishing to serve remote communities throughout the Dakota Territory. Someone with proven skills in frontier medicine, knowledge of traditional healing practices, and the courage to work in places where conventional doctors feared to venture. Lieutenant Blackwood tells me his sister has become quite accomplished in medical arts, Dr. Walsh said, as she examined their dwelling and gardens with obvious approval. He also tells me she's learned things about traditional healing that could revolutionize how we approach medicine in frontier communities. Mercy felt her heart racing as she began to understand what was being offered. "You want me to work with you? But surely you know about my circumstances." Dr. Walsh's laugh was rich with humor that held no judgment. "My dear girl, I've been breaking social conventions since before you were born. What matters to me is competence, not conformity. If you can heal the sick and save lives, I couldn't care less who you share your bed with or what color his skin might be." But the proposal went deeper than simple employment. Dr. Walsh had been observing the changes in frontier society, the slow but growing recognition that survival in harsh territory required cooperation and understanding between different peoples. She envisioned a new kind of medical practice that drew on all available knowledge, rather than limiting itself to European traditions while dismissing native healing arts as superstition. "I need someone who can serve as a bridge," she explained, "to both Mercy and Ayana. Someone who understands both worlds and can help me establish clinics that serve everyone, regardless of race or social position. It would be dangerous work, and the pay would be modest, but the opportunity to save lives and change minds would be considerable." Ayana listened to the proposal with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read between the lines. "Of white society's offers, and what would be my role in this arrangement? I suspect frontier communities would not welcome a Modoc warrior as a medical practitioner, regardless of his qualifications." Dr. Walsh studied him with the same direct assessment she had given their dwelling and gardens. "Actually, I was hoping you might consider working with us as well. Not openly at first, perhaps, but there are many ways a person with your knowledge could contribute to healing work while maintaining discretion about his background." The conversation that followed stretched late into the night, covering practical considerations and philosophical questions in equal measure. Dr. Walsh painted a picture of a future where medical knowledge was shared freely across cultural boundaries, where healing became a force for bringing people together rather than maintaining the divisions that had caused so much suffering. For Mercy, the proposal offered everything she had dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. Meaningful work that used all her capabilities, the chance to honor both her mother's legacy and the traditional knowledge she had learned from Ayana, and most importantly, a way to remain true to the love she had found while still contributing to the wider world. For Ayana, it represented something even more profound, a chance to fulfill the dreams he had shared with Makawi, to serve as a bridge between peoples rather than a warrior dividing them. The irony that this opportunity came through his relationship with a white woman was not lost on him, but perhaps that irony was itself part of the healing that both peoples needed. The decision, when it finally came, felt as natural as breathing. They would leave the sacred valley not permanently, but as a base to return to when the work grew too difficult or the world's hostility became too much to bear. They would join Dr. Walsh's mission, contributing their combined knowledge to healing work that could save lives and gradually change attitudes through the simple demonstration that cooperation produced better results than conflict. Their last morning in the valley dawned clear and bright, with spring warmth that promised the kind of traveling weather that made long journeys possible rather than merely endurable. As they packed their belongings and prepared to close up the dwelling that had sheltered them through the transformative months of winter, Mercy and Ayana both understood that they were leaving as different people than they had been when they arrived. The sacred valley had given them more than physical sanctuary. It had provided the space and time they needed to discover who they could become when freed from the expectations and limitations that their respective societies had tried to impose on them. They had learned that love could exist without ownership, that partnership could be built on equality rather than dominance, and that understanding could bridge any divide when people were willing to meet each other with open hearts and minds. As they began the journey that would take them back into the world they had fled, Mercy rode beside Ayana with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. Behind them, the sacred valley settled back into the timeless rhythm that had sustained it for centuries, ready to offer sanctuary to the next souls who needed healing and transformation. Ahead lay a future full of challenges and possibilities in equal measure. There would be communities that welcomed their healing work and others that rejected it based on prejudice and fear. There would be moments of triumph when lives were saved and minds were changed, and moments of discouragement when old hatreds proved stronger than new understanding. But they would face all of it together as equals, with the knowledge that love had given them the strength to survive the Badlands and the wisdom to see beyond the artificial barriers that divided their peoples. The girl who had collapsed beside the ancestor stones and the exiled warrior who had carried her to safety had become something new. Healers, bridge builders, living proof that the human spirit could transcend any boundary when guided by courage and compassion. In the years that followed, their names would become legend in their own way, spoken with respect in frontier communities where their medical skills had saved lives that conventional medicine had given up on. But the real measure of their success would not be found in the stories told about them, but in the slow, steady change in attitudes that their daily example made possible, one healed patient and one opened mind at a time. The Badlands had tested them and found them worthy. Now it was time to discover what the wider world would make of the love they had forged in its sacred places, and what that love might accomplish when offered freely to all who needed healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.